Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift into a world where bronze glimmers beneath a rising sun and the quiet shuffle of sandals on packed earth signals the beginning of a story older than the myths themselves. Tonight, as you fall asleep, we begin the long, winding journey through the entire history of the hoplites, the citizen soldiers of ancient Greece, whose rigid discipline, heavy armor, and unwavering unity shaped the fate of a civilization. But before we step onto the battlefield, before the dust rises and the shields lock, we start somewhere softer, quieter, in a world still forming its identity, still learning what war even means. Imagine the Greek landscape before the phalanx, before the polished bronze helmets and round aspis shields became symbols of order and control. Picture scattered villagers clinging to rocky hillsides, farmers tending dry soil, and storytellers whispering legends of gods who shaped mountains with their hands. It is here, among these early communities, that the first seeds of hoplite warfare begin to stir. Some historians believe the rise of the hoplite was not sudden but slow, emerging from centuries of constant threats along the coasts, rival clans over the hills, ambitious nobles seeking power. Others suggest it came from a deeper cultural shift, a move toward unity in a world that demanded collective strength simply to survive. No single moment marks the birth of the hoplite. Instead, it's a murmur growing louder across generations. And in that murmur, we sense the heartbeat of something new. An army not of kings or elites, but of citizens who fight side by side, shield to shield, as equals. Listen for the faint metallic clink as a blacksmith hammers the first domed helmets, the scrape of bronze against wood as early shields take shape, the steady breath of a farmer who knows that one day he may be called to stand not for a king, but for his home, his land, his people. The world is changing, slowly but unmistakably. A new kind of warrior is rising, one defined not by personal glory, but by discipline, cohesion, and the weight of a shield that protects not only the bearer but the man beside him. And as we drift deeper into this story, one lingering question remains. When ordinary men shoulder extraordinary armor, what kind of world will they build next? As we drift deeper into this ancient landscape, the world begins to take on the texture and weight of bronze, and the emerging hoplite becomes more than a whisper, he becomes a presence. Sit back, breathe slowly, and imagine the rhythmic glow of a furnace in a small Greek workshop, where molten metal slides like sunlight made liquid, poured into molds that will someday shield entire cities. This is where the identity of the hoplite truly forms. Not on the battlefield, but in these humble spaces where craftsmen shape the tools of unity and survival. Some scholars believe the sudden abundance of bronze gear across the Greek world was a sign of growing wealth, a prosperity that allowed common citizens to afford helmets, greaves, and shields. Others suggest the spread of armor was more ideological than economic, a statement that every man, regardless of birth, carried a responsibility to defend his polis. Whatever the reason, the transformation is unmistakable. The hoplite begins to wear his world like a second skin. You can almost feel the weight of the Corinthian helmet, its narrow eye slits forcing a man to see the world in a focused, tunnel-like gaze. The metal smells faintly of smoke and earth, and when worn, it muffles the outside world until all that remains is the slow echo of one's own heartbeat. The cuirass, whether made of layered linen or rigid bronze, rests heavy on the chest, pressing down like the expectations of an entire community. And then there is the aspis round, wooden, bronze-faced, and impossibly wide. It is both shield and symbol, a physical manifestation of duty. When held alone, it feels cumbersome, almost too large for one person. But that is the point. Some researchers believe its size was intentional, designed to cover not just its bearer, but the person standing to his left. It is a reminder that a hoplite never fights alone. His strength is not his own. As you picture row after row of shields being painted with swirling emblems of serpents, lions, gorgons, you can almost hear the quiet pride of a community preparing for the inevitable. The air in the workshop is thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes transformation. The hoplite is no longer just a farmer, a potter, a shepherd. He is becoming something new, a warrior shaped not by personal ambition, but by the collective heartbeat of the polis. And as he lifts his shield for the first time, feeling its weight steady and reassuring, we are left with a question that lingers in the stillness. When ordinary citizens are armed with extraordinary unity, what forces in the ancient world will dare to stand against them? Now let your mind settle into the rhythmic pulse of an army learning to breathe as one. As the hoplite emerges from the shadows of early Greek society, something remarkable begins to take shape, a formation so disciplined, so tightly woven, that it becomes the backbone of an era. This is the phalanx, the living wall of bronze and willpower. Picture a quiet morning on a dusty field outside a young Greek city-state. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants gather with shields strapped to their arms and spears upright, forming long lines that stretch across the earth. There is no fanfare, no elaborate ceremony, just the steady scrape of shields being adjusted and boots digging into the soil. Some scholars believe the phalanx evolved naturally from hunting formations or clan-based warbands, where cooperation meant survival. Others suggest it was a response to the geography of Greece itself, narrow valleys and mountainous terrain that favored close, compact styles of combat. There is even the theory that the phalanx was a political statement, a physical expression of equality among citizens who fought not for kings, but for each other. Whatever its origins, what matters is the effect, a group of individuals becoming a single organism. Listen to the rhythm as the formation tightens. Shields interlock, bronze rims clacking softly like a whispered promise. The spears tilt forward, a forest of sharpened points that seem to hum in the morning breeze. Each man stands half hidden behind the shield of the man beside him, and in that subtle overlap lies the entire philosophy of the hoplite. Your life protects mine. My shield guards you. Together, we are stronger than any one of us could ever be alone. The phalanx moves slowly at first, each man adjusting to the weight of armor and the pressure of the ranks behind him. But once they find their rhythm, once the collective breath sinks and the steps fall into perfect unity, the phalanx becomes something ancient writers described with awe, an unbreakable wall of men whose resolve outweighs fear itself. Some observers believed the phalanx was less about bravery and more about discipline, a kind of social contract made real through bronze and muscle. Others noted its psychological power. The sheer presence of a silent, advancing phalanx was enough to unsettle even seasoned opponents. As we watch this new formation take shape, a soft question drifts through the air like dust rising from the ground. When unity becomes a weapon, how does it reshape the destiny of the people who wield it? Imagine standing in the early dawn, the first rays of sun glinting off polished bronze, catching your eye in dazzling, almost blinding flashes, and the weight of history pressing down through the metal itself. The hoplite's armor was not just protection. It was a declaration, a statement of presence and purpose that defined both individual and collective identity. each cuirass molded to the contours of the chest, sculpted like a second skin of bronze, reflected the artistry and technical skill of craftsmen who had spent years perfecting their craft. Corinthian helmets, with their long, T-shaped slits for eyes and mouth, seemed almost alive, giving the wearer an appearance both anonymous and terrifying, the face beneath concealed. Yet the personality of the unit revealed in the disciplined alignment of thousands moving as one. The aspis, the round shield, nearly a meter across, became an extension of the hoplite's body, curving outward to embrace both man and neighbor. Polished bronze catching the sun and painted with symbols of city, family, or personal valor. Spears, typically 7 to 9 feet long, balanced between a fence and reach, allowed men to strike without exposing themselves, forming a forest of deadly points when rows advanced together, their tips almost shimmering as they swayed with the disciplined march. Some researchers believe the armor's weight, often exceeding 30 kilograms, was meant to condition soldiers, to forge endurance as much as provide protection, while others suggest the psychological impact of the glinting metal in formation was as critical as any physical advantage. Notice the small details, the engraved lines along the cuirass, the rivets on the shield, the way the bronze tongue of the helmet creaked against the wearer's jaw with every turn of the head. Even the sand beneath their feet became part of the instrument, muffling the shuffle of boots, letting the rhythm of the formation speak louder than words. Hoplites trained for hours, learning to pivot with shields interlocked, spears pointing forward, shoulders brushing in perfect synchrony, creating a machine of flesh and bronze. Their gladius, shorter than the sarissa, would be reserved for when formations broke and combat descended to the chaotic intimacy of close quarters. Every dent and scratch on the armor told a story of previous battles, of survival and skill, of fear confronted and perhaps overcome. And yet, even the most perfectly forged hoplite, adorned and armed for war, would only be truly powerful when part of the phalanx, when his individual strength became inseparable from the collective force. As we linger on these details, the question emerges softly, almost like a whisper through the metal. What does it mean for a man to lose himself in formation, to become both invisible and invincible at once? Close your eyes for a moment and picture a dusty training ground just outside the city walls, the smell of sweat and earth mingling in the morning air, the sharp clang of bronze striking bronze as young men run, march, and spar with a rhythm that echoes through time. Hoplite training was relentless, a ritual that began in adolescence and continued for decades, shaping not only muscles but minds. They learned to bear the weight of armor that could crush lungs and muscles alike, to move in perfect harmony with neighbors, to trust the man beside them with their life, and to trust themselves above all else in the chaos of battle. Some researchers suggest that drills focused as much on psychological endurance as physical skill, creating soldiers capable of standing unmoved even when the enemy seemed to overwhelm them. Others note that the routines included dance-like movements, footwork, and synchronized steps that doubled as both discipline and ritual, reinforcing social cohesion while also sharpening agility. Spears were tested in repeated thrusts, shields rammed in mock engagements, the echoes of clashing metal ringing off stone walls and into the ears of each trainee, embedding a cadence of war that would be recalled in the most desperate moments. The phalanx was drilled endlessly, row upon row moving in unison, a living wall of bronze and determination, learning to advance, retreat, pivot, and respond without spoken command. relying instead on intuition and the unspoken understanding of shared purpose. They practiced in conditions that mirrored potential battlefields, from soft sand that tested balance to uneven rock that punished missteps, ensuring no terrain would surprise them. Some historians suggest that this daily exposure to discomfort and repetition created a form of mental armor, a resilience that would be tested in wars spanning decades. Beyond the physical and tactical hoplite training instilled a moral code, a blend of honor, loyalty, and civic responsibility, linking the soldier not only to his comrades, but to the city-state itself. Victory was shared. Defeat, though feared, was faced collectively. Imagine the sound of 1,000 shields grinding as phalanxes practice their advance. The rhythm almost musical, yet tinged with menace, a prelude to the violence of real combat. And yet, in this disciplined, repetitive world, there remained an element of unpredictability, a reminder that even the best-trained hoplite was human, vulnerable to fear, hesitation, and the chaos that war inevitably brings. As we leave the clamor of the training grounds behind, one question lingers in the cool air. How much of a soldier's strength comes from the armor he wears, and how much from the invisible forge of discipline and fear within? Now, picture a battlefield at dawn, mist curling low over uneven ground, the smell of wet earth and sweat thick in the air, the distant bleat of sheep and the faint toll of temple bells carrying across the hills. Thousands of hoplites stand shoulder to shoulder, bronze glinting faintly in the emerging light, their shields overlapping to form an unbroken wall, sarissas or spears poised to strike. A forest of polished points stretching toward the horizon. Some historians argue that the phalanx was less a formation and more a living organism, each man's life intertwined with the man beside him, dependent on coordination, trust, and relentless discipline. Others suggest that the psychological impact of such a mass of bronze, moving as one, cannot be overstated. The enemy would see not men but an impenetrable force, a ripple of polished metal and motion that could inspire terror even before the first clash. Sound carried strangely across the lines, the rhythmic shuffle of feet, the low chant of commanders, the metallic groan of shields pressed against one another, all forming a kind of martial music that bound the phalanx together. The hoplites' advance was deliberate, almost hypnotic, designed to maintain cohesion while closing the distance with the enemy, their heavy armor slowing them but also giving them an intimidating presence. Each step, each thrust of the spear was synchronized, and the training of years ensured that instinct took over where conscious thought faltered. Yet the phalanx was not invincible. Broken terrain, sudden flanking maneuvers, and gaps caused by fatigue or fear could turn order into chaos in moments. And historians note countless battles where phalanxes collapsed under conditions their training could not anticipate. Cavalry charges, missile troops, and unexpected terrain were the constant threats, reminding us that even the most disciplined force has limits. Some researchers emphasize that the success of the phalanx relied heavily on leadership, communication, and morale as much as on bronze and muscle, with commanders reading subtle shifts in the formation to anticipate weaknesses and exploit them. As the sun rises higher, casting long reflections off helmets and shields, one can almost hear the low, unspoken tension among the ranks, the shared heartbeat of men prepared to die for a city, for honor, for the invisible thread that bound them together. And just as the first enemy charge hits, shattering the calm, one must wonder, is it the iron and bronze that defines the hoplite, or the unbreakable discipline that lies beneath, invisible yet unyielding, ready to hold or fall. Picture, if you will, a sun-bleached plain stretching endlessly, the air heavy with dust and anticipation, as rows upon rows of hoplites lock shields and step forward as one. The phalanx was not merely a formation. It was a living, breathing entity, a wall of bronze, wood, and disciplined muscle that moved with a terrifying synchronicity. Each hoplite's aspis shield overlapped with his neighbor, creating a near-impenetrable barrier, while the long, pointed dory extended beyond, forming a forest of spear tips glinting under the Mediterranean sun. Some historians argue that the phalanx's strength lay in its collective discipline, while others suggest that its vulnerability was precisely in this interdependence. One misstep could ripple through the line, shattering cohesion in an instant. Imagine the sounds, the rhythmic thump of shields pressing together, the grunt of exertion as men pushed against their fellows and the enemy, the whisper of sand and gravel under armored feet, all blending into a tense, almost hypnotic cadence that signaled both unity and imminent violence. Training for the phalanx was relentless. Hoplites drilled for hours on end, learning to march, pivot, and thrust in perfect unison, every movement timed to reinforce the wall of men around them. Some researchers believe that these drills were as much mental conditioning as physical, forging trust, patience, and instantaneous reaction into every soldier. Others suggest that the formation's psychological impact on enemies was as potent as its physical power. To face a perfectly aligned wall of bronze and wood, advancing with deadly precision, was to confront a force that seemed less human and more elemental, unstoppable and inevitable. Yet, the phalanx had its limits. Its effectiveness waned on broken or uneven terrain, where the rigid ranks could not maintain alignment, and gaps emerged that agile enemies could exploit. Commanders had to understand the land as intimately as they understood the formation, choosing battlegrounds where the phalanx could excel and adapting tactics when conditions turned against them. Combined arms, cavalry, light infantry, and missile troops began to emerge as essential complements, adding flexibility to an otherwise formidable but inflexible force. From the tight discipline of these formations, we start to glimpse the paradox of hoplite warfare, unmatched in unity, terrifying in frontal assault, yet constrained by terrain, coordination, and the human limitations of those who carried the weight of bronze and expectation. And so, as the sun rises over another imagined battlefield, the question lingers: how would this perfected machine of war fare when faced with enemies who refused to meet it head-on, preferring cunning, speed, and unpredictability over brute strength? The hoplite was never merely a soldier. He was a citizen, a man whose armor and training were intertwined with the very fabric of Greek civic life, each bronze cuirass a reflection of both personal status and communal responsibility. In cities like Athens and Sparta, the hoplite represented the ideal of civic duty, where ownership of land and participation in governance were inseparable from military service. Some scholars suggest that this link between arms and politics created a society unusually invested in the defense of its own freedoms, while others argue it also imposed rigid hierarchies, where those without means could never participate fully in the military or political sphere. Imagine the weight of a Corinthian helmet, polished to a mirror sheen, pressing down as a young citizen stood in assembly, knowing that his voice and his spear carried equal significance. Hoplites trained not only for battle, but for ritual and public ceremony, parading in festivals, drilling in open squares, and demonstrating prowess that blended martial skill with civic pride. In Sparta, this connection was elevated to an art of life. From childhood, boys were molded to serve, to endure, and to uphold the collective, their education inseparable from military discipline. Others suggest that in less militarized city-states, the hoplites' role was both symbolic and practical, a reminder that the defense of the polis required commitment from every man who could bear arms. Yet, this intertwining of society and soldiering had its tensions. The reliance on wealthy citizens to equip themselves meant that economic disparities could translate directly into military power, privileging the affluent and sometimes leaving poorer citizens on the periphery of defense. Mercenary service would eventually challenge this model, but during the classical period, the hoplites' bronze and leather became markers of status as well as tools of war. Beyond individual wealth, the phalanx demanded collective trust. Each man depended on the skill, courage, and loyalty of his neighbor, a microcosm of the city itself. Disunity could mean death, while cohesion offered security and strength. From the political assemblies to the dusty training grounds, the hoplite lived in constant dialogue with the ideals of citizenship, honor, and duty, embodying a culture in which war and governance were inseparably linked. Yet, as we move forward into the rise of mercenaries, professional armies, and the eventual collapse of traditional hoplite dominance, one wonders, could this intricate social contract survive the pressures of evolving warfare? Or was the citizen soldier destined to be replaced by a new breed of professional, whose loyalty could be bought rather than earned through shared duty? As centuries passed, the rigid formations that had defined hoplite warfare began to evolve, shaped by both technological innovation and the pressures of increasingly sophisticated enemies. Yet the essence of the phalanx remained a testament to discipline and coordination. Early hoplites had relied almost exclusively on the strength of the spear and shield, forming dense lines that advanced with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, each man pressing shoulder to shoulder, a human wall of bronze and leather. Some researchers believe this cohesion was as much psychological as physical. The fear of breaking ranks, of betraying one's neighbor, enforced an almost ritualistic obedience, while others suggest that the formation's success lay in sheer physics. The concentrated mass of men and overlapping shields producing a force that few early armies could resist. As Greek city-states encountered more diverse foes, including cavalry-heavy Persian armies or irregular light infantry, hoplite tactics were forced to adapt. Combined arms approaches began to appear, integrating skirmishers, archers, and eventually even early artillery, though always subordinated to the primacy of the phalanx. The length of the sarissa in later Hellenistic formations, reaching nearly 18 feet, reflected a shift toward reach and intimidation, designed to dominate enemy lines before contact could occur. Yet this very specialization introduced vulnerabilities on broken terrain or against flexible enemies. The Macedonian phalanx of Philip II and Alexander the Great represented a culmination of this evolution. Elite, professional soldiers drilled in precise maneuvers, coordinated with cavalry wings and auxiliary units that added mobility and tactical diversity. Yet, as the Roman manipular system rose to prominence, the limitations of traditional hoplite methods became apparent. Romans exploited gaps, terrain irregularities, and the rigidity of formations, demonstrating that adaptability often outweighed concentrated mass. Archaeological evidence, including battlefield excavations and remnants of training grounds, suggests that hoplite tactics were never static. They were continuously refined through experience, failure, and improvisation. Some scholars propose that the psychological discipline of the phalanx was as vital as the physical arrangement, instilling confidence in men who might otherwise panic under pressure, while others emphasize the innovation in combined arms and logistics that allowed hoplites to operate far from their home cities, from one battlefield to the next. The evolution of hoplite tactics reveals a delicate balance between tradition and adaptation, a constant struggle to maintain cohesion while responding to new threats. And yet, despite centuries of refinement, the question remains: when the age of professional armies and flexible manipular units arrived, could the phalanx, this seemingly invincible formation, survive the tests of changing warfare, or was its fate always tied to the conditions that first made it great? As we step away from the smoke and clamor of battle, let us trace the quiet evolution of hoplite warfare, the subtle shifts that transformed bronze-clad men into a system both formidable and fragile. Sit back, relax, and imagine the Aegean coastline, sun-dappled hills rolling into the distance. As Greek city-states began to refine the art of war, not in sudden flashes of genius, but through decades of trial, error, and adaptation, early hoplites moved in simple formations, shields overlapping, spears braced, their success dependent on sheer weight of numbers and collective courage. But as conflicts became prolonged, some historians suggest, commanders recognized the limitations of relying solely on mass. The phalanx, for all its disciplined might, struggled on uneven ground against nimble enemies, or when coordination faltered, and so began the gradual integration of flexible strategies, the deployment of light infantry, skirmishers, and specialized units to guard flanks, harass enemies, and exploit gaps. Others point out that social change fueled tactical innovation. Citizen soldiers could not always be mobilized indefinitely, and mercenaries, Thracian, and other auxiliaries brought unfamiliar fighting methods that required commanders to think beyond the rigid depth of the traditional phalanx. Weapons evolved to spears, varied in length, shields in curvature, armor in weight, each adjustment reflecting lessons learned on past battlefields. Researchers debate the extent to which these changes were intentional or emergent, the product of conscious military science or the chaotic pressure of survival. Yet the evidence is clear. Hoplites were no longer merely a line of bronze. They became a system, an interconnected network of capabilities, adaptable yet still anchored in the collective discipline that defined their identity. Visualize a phalanx advancing through a rocky pass, each hoplite adjusting his stance, shields angling to deflect projectiles, lighter troops weaving round to disrupt enemy formations, commanders signaling maneuvers with subtle gestures, every detail rehearsed, yet responsive to the unpredictable dance of combat. And here lies the tension that haunted Greek generals, the desire to maintain the overwhelming psychological power of mass, while accommodating the unpredictable realities of terrain, morale, and enemy innovation. In studying these adaptations, some scholars suggest that the seeds of modern combined arms warfare were already present in the Aegean hills, hidden within the rigid bronze that so often concealed remarkable flexibility. And as we leave the hillsides of early Greek battlefields and move toward the great conflicts of the classical period, one cannot help but wonder, had the phalanx reached its ultimate form? Or was it merely the beginning of a story that would echo far beyond the narrow confines of Greek warfare? Now we move into the heart of classical Greece, where the hoplite phalanx reached its peak, a formation both elegant and terrifying. A wall of bronze and discipline that could dominate the battlefield, yet remained vulnerable to cunning and circumstance. Picture the plains of Marathon or the narrow passes of Thermopylae. The sunlight glinting off polished Corinthian helmets, shields braced shoulder to shoulder, the sarusses and spears extending outward like a forest of steel. Some researchers suggest that the phalanx was as much psychological as physical, its cohesion projecting invincibility, instilling fear even before combat began. Soldiers drilled relentlessly, their movements synchronized to create waves of coordinated pressure, advancing or retreating as one organism, their lives dependent on mutual trust. Yet classical phalanx warfare was far from static. City-states experimented with variations, denser ranks for crushing impact, shallower formations for speed and maneuverability, the introduction of lighter hoplites for flanking, and cavalry screens to guard against encirclement. Others propose that the phalanx's brilliance was matched by its fragility. On broken ground, against unexpected tactics, or when morale faltered, the imposing wall could fracture, exposing soldiers trained for collective action to deadly individual combat. Consider the Battle of Leuctra, where the Theban general Epaminondas concentrated his elite troops on a single flank, disrupting traditional formations and rewriting the rules of engagement. This was not mere brute force, but the careful application of strategy against a formation optimized for uniformity and stability. The phalanx, for all its power, demanded coordination, discipline, and trust, which could be both its strength and its undoing. Meanwhile, the evolution of armor and weaponry continued. Spears shortened for agility, shields lighter for endurance, bronze cuirasses sculpted to fit the human form, all reflecting lessons learned through centuries of warfare. Social context also shaped tactics. Citizen soldiers balanced military obligations with civic life, introducing constraints and expectations that mercenary forces later would not face. As we listen to the imagined clash of bronze, the grunts, the rhythm of advance, it becomes clear that hoplite warfare was more than a series of battles. It was a complex interaction of technology, human psychology, and social organization. And as the phalanx would later encounter the rising power of Rome, we are left with a lingering question. Could this iconic formation, perfected over generations, withstand the innovations and flexibility of new military minds? Or was its fate already written in the rhythms of bronze and blood? Sit back, relax, and imagine the world behind the polished bronze, behind the disciplined rows of hoplites advancing across sun-baked plains. The life of a hoplite was not merely defined by battle. It was a rhythm of preparation, community, and duty, a blend of social expectation and martial necessity. Each soldier's armor, meticulously maintained, was more than protection. It was a symbol of status, identity, and commitment. Every dent and scratch a story of survival or near miss. Some researchers believe that hoplite training began in youth, a gradual forging of endurance, strength, and precision, while others suggest it was passed from father to son, a tradition encoded in sweat, ritual, and familial pride. Imagine the soundscape of a city-state preparing for war. The metallic clink of helmets, the shuffle of leather sandals on stone, instructors shouting commands, recruits mirroring movements with Spartan precision, their bodies attuned to a choreography of conflict that would one day decide the fate of their polis. The social dimension was equally critical. Hoplites were citizens first, warriors second, their service linked to property ownership, civic rights, and the honor of their families. This connection between battlefield performance and societal standing created pressures. Beyond mere survival, failure could mean shame, disgrace, and the erosion of one's position in the community. Others suggest that this very intertwining of military and civic identity fostered remarkable cohesion within units, a trust that allowed rows of bronze to function as a single organism, advancing and retreating in seamless coordination. Yet, life was not always rigid discipline. Off the battlefield, hoplites engaged in local politics, festivals, and social gatherings, sharpening alliances and rivalries that could influence military decisions. Their training continued in peacetime through festivals, mock battles, and competitive games, blending physical conditioning with psychological preparation, reinforcing the communal bonds that made phalanx formations effective. The weight of the hoplites' panoply, shield, greaves, cuirass, and spear was a constant reminder of duty, and even during rest, soldiers honed their skills, inspected their equipment, and absorbed lessons from veterans whose experiences mapped out the thin line between glory and death. From this, we begin to see that hoplite warfare was not a series of isolated events, but a lifestyle, a continuum of preparation, performance, and social expectation. And as we move forward into the evolution of hoplite tactics, the question arises, how did these citizen soldiers, bound by honor and tradition, adapt when confronted by enemies who challenged the very foundations of their carefully constructed world? As the classical period waned, the Greek world entered an era defined less by citizen militias and more by professional warriors, a transformation that would reshape the identity of the hoplite forever. Sit back and imagine the bustling ports and dusty roads of the Hellenistic kingdoms, where mercenary recruiters scoured the countryside and distant lands for men skilled in the arts of war. These soldiers, unlike the traditional hoplite, were bound not by civic duty or personal honor, but by contracts, pay, and promises of loot or land, a reality that introduced both opportunity and uncertainty to armies that had once relied on the loyalty of citizens. Some researchers suggest that the integration of mercenaries brought unparalleled tactical diversity to Greek armies, as warriors from Thrace, Gaul, and beyond brought curved swords, slashing techniques, and flexible skirmishing methods into formations once dominated by spears and shields. Others believe that this reliance created profound vulnerabilities, for the cohesion and morale that had sustained hoplite phalanxes for centuries now depended on the whims of paymasters and the ability to maintain steady funding in times of extended campaigns. Picture the glittering bronze of traditional armor juxtaposed with the lighter, more agile garb of foreign warriors, creating a patchwork of styles and skills that commanders had to orchestrate, like conductors of a delicate symphony, where one misstep could lead to chaos on the battlefield. The psychological impact of these mercenary forces cannot be understated. Their presence both inspired confidence and sowed doubt. For the old citizen soldier, ideal where valor and civic pride intertwined was giving way to professional pragmatism. Hellenistic generals experimented with combined arms tactics, blending hoplites with cavalry, archers, and these new mercenaries to create formations capable of both brute force and subtle maneuvering. Yet, the reliance on paid soldiers also forced a shift in strategy, emphasizing shorter, decisive engagements to preserve loyalty and minimize desertion, a stark contrast to the prolonged wars of earlier centuries. Through these adaptations, the hoplite remained central yet increasingly complemented, a symbol of tradition within a fluid, mercenary-driven military ecosystem. Archaeological finds, fragments, helmet designs, and inscriptions detailing payments hint at the scale and organization required to sustain these forces, providing glimpses into a world where warfare was no longer a civic duty but a profession. And yet, for all their skill and discipline, these hoplites of the Hellenistic age faced a question that would shadow them to the end. Could their methods, honed for centuries on citizen loyalty and formation combat, survive in a world where money and mobility dictated the outcomes of wars? As the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE unfolded, the very foundations of hoplite warfare began to tremble under pressures both external and internal, ushering in a transformation that would mark the end of an era. Sit back and picture the wide plains of the Macedonian and Greek territories, where rows of bronze-clad warriors once stood like living walls, sarissas glinting in the sun, shields polished to mirror brightness. Every step in perfect unison. These formations, the embodiment of centuries of tactical refinement, now confronted an enemy whose methods seemed almost alien, the Roman legions. Some historians argue that it was not brute force alone that gave Rome an edge, but the combination of flexibility, organization, and relentless training that allowed small units to operate independently while maintaining cohesion, a concept almost unimaginable to traditional hoplite commanders. Others suggest that the fall of the hoplite was inevitable, a consequence of societal changes, mercenary dependence, and logistical demands that strained Hellenistic kingdoms to their limits. Imagine the terrain of pivotal battles like Pydna, broken and uneven, unsuitable for the rigid phalanx, where gaps opened like invisible traps and once symbols of unstoppable reach became unwieldy liabilities. The Romans, with their manipular system, flowed into these gaps with precision, each legionary acting with initiative while the unit moved as one, exploiting weaknesses that the Greeks had never faced on the level plains where hoplites had once dominated. The sound of metal clashing, shields breaking, and the cries of warriors filled the air, a stark contrast to the coordinated march that had once inspired fear and awe. The collapse of the Macedonian phalanx at Pydna was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation that centuries of accumulated knowledge, discipline, and martial pride could be undone by adaptability and innovation. Beyond the battlefield, the social fabric that supported hoplite warfare eroded. The citizen-soldier ideal, the sacred connection between property, military service, and civic duty, had been replaced by mercenary leaving Greek armies vulnerable not only to Roman tactics, but to the very nature of their changing society. The phalanx, once the pinnacle of military engineering, now seemed almost fossilized, unable to respond to dynamic threats, its strengths exposed as critical weaknesses in the face of flexible enemies. Yet, even in defeat, the influence of hoplites endured. Roman military engineers and officers meticulously studied Greek equipment, formations, and siege techniques, absorbing lessons that would echo through centuries of warfare. And as the dust settled on the shattered lines of Pydna, one question lingered in the minds of those who witnessed the transition. Could any force ever recreate the disciplined might of the hoplites, or was their age, like bronze itself, destined to become a relic of history, admired but no longer feared? By 146 BCE, the once proud Greek city-states faced a new reality. And nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in the siege of Corinth, a city whose walls had once repelled invaders and whose citizen soldiers embodied the very essence of hoplite warfare. Imagine approaching the city from a distance, its fortifications rising like a stone crown above the landscape, Corinthian helmets glinting atop ramparts, shields lined in perfect order, and the sound of drills echoing faintly across the plain. Some scholars argue that the city's defenses represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic military engineering, combining classical Greek fortification principles with innovations developed over centuries of conflict. Others suggest that the imposing walls, while impressive, were already obsolete, a testament to an era where formation discipline outweighed tactical adaptability. As Roman forces, experienced in siegecraft, honed through campaigns across Italy and the Mediterranean, approached Corinth, the limitations of traditional hoplite tactics became immediately apparent. The Romans employed a systematic approach, coordinating artillery, siege engines, and manipular infantry movements to probe, weaken, and ultimately breach defenses that had been formidable under older standards of warfare. The hoplites, trained for open-field engagement in disciplined phalanx formations, struggled to adapt to confined spaces, uneven terrain, and the multi-directional assaults that the Romans executed with relentless precision. The clash of bronze and iron, the tension of anticipation, and the faint cries of defenders revealed a deeper story. The fall of Corinth was not merely the capture of a city, but the symbolic extinguishing of a military culture that had defined the Mediterranean for centuries. Some researchers note that even in the final moments, Greek soldiers demonstrated the courage and skill that had made hoplites legendary. Yet their training, equipment, and tactical doctrine were increasingly irrelevant in the face of adaptive enemies. The systematic destruction of Corinth was thorough, leaving no question about the consequences of rigid adherence to past methods. Bronze panoplies, Corinthian helmets, and Aspis shields were stripped from walls and streets, collected as trophies, and sent to Rome, where they would serve both as symbols of conquest and as practical references for Roman military adaptation. In the quiet aftermath, the social structures that had sustained hoplite service citizenship, property ownership, and civic obligation were irreversibly disrupted, replaced by administrative and military systems designed for empire rather than city-state autonomy. Yet even as Corinth fell, its legacy whispered across history. The principles of formation, discipline, and coordinated tactics would not vanish, but be absorbed, transformed, and immortalized within Roman doctrine. The question that lingered, subtle but persistent, was whether the essence of the hoplite's courage, unity, and methodical precision would ever find expression again, or if the very age that had forged them was now permanently relegated to the dust of history, a story to be admired, studied, and mourned. Imagine the weight of bronze pressing against your shoulders, the metallic clang of armor echoing in rhythm with hundreds of other men, each one a living cog in a moving wall designed to crush or be crushed. The hoplite did not merely bear a physical burden. He carried the expectations of his polis, the honor of his family, and the silent pressure of those shoulder to shoulder beside him. A typical hoplite carried a helmet, cuirass greaves, and a large Aspis shield, while grasping a dory spear often reaching 7 to 9 feet in length, and the cumulative weight could easily exceed 50 pounds. This equipment demanded both strength and endurance, yet it was not merely a matter of physical preparation. It required mental fortitude. Some historians suggest that the psychological conditioning of hoplites began in youth, with boys observing and eventually participating in martial training that instilled obedience, courage, and a near instinctive understanding of formation cohesion. Others emphasize the ritualistic aspects, the communal meals, religious ceremonies, and city-sponsored festivals that reinforced loyalty to the polis and created bonds that were essential when facing the terror of battle. The very design of the shield exemplified this dual burden. Not only a defensive tool, it symbolized the collective responsibility of the phalanx, for a gap in one line could endanger dozens of comrades. Witness accounts, poetry, and vase paintings convey the tension and intensity of this experience. The deafening clash of metal, the earth trembling beneath marching feet, the smell of sweat and blood mingled with the dust of countless engagements. The hoplites' role was both to endure and to perform, to transform fear into controlled aggression, and to act as a single entity within a larger organism that moved with precision and purpose. Training regimens emphasized repetition and familiarity. Formations were drilled until movement became instinctual, each man attuned to the subtle shifts of those beside him. Some researchers argue that this combination of physical rigor and psychological conditioning created an almost hypnotic focus, where individual fear was subsumed by collective momentum, while others caution that this very dependency on cohesion created vulnerability, break the formation, and discipline alone could not save the individual soldier. The burden of the hoplite was thus an intricate weave of metal, muscle, mind, and society, each thread essential to survival and success. Yet one cannot help but wonder, beneath the polished bronze and disciplined ranks, how many men felt the raw human terror that history seldom records? And how did that fear shape the very tactics that would later captivate, intimidate, and eventually succumb to the innovations of Rome? Picture the moment when the quiet tension of a Greek plain transforms into the deafening roar of combat. A wall of bronze and iron advancing with synchronized precision, shields locking, spears thrusting in unison. The hoplite phalanx, a marvel of disciplined aggression, moved as a single organism, each man's survival dependent on the collective strength and cohesion of his comrades. Ancient accounts describe the almost hypnotic cadence of their advance, the ground vibrating beneath thousands of marching feet, the metallic flash of helmets catching the sun as the lines approached the enemy. Some scholars suggest that this unity created a psychological weapon as potent as the physical one, projecting an aura of inevitability and intimidation that could erode enemy morale before blades even met. Within the phalanx, individual heroics were rare, but when they did occur, they were amplified by the surrounding mass. A single man's courage could stabilize a wavering line or inspire a desperate thrust that turned the tide. Yet, battle was never purely mechanical. Variations in terrain, weather, and enemy tactics constantly tested the rigidity of formations, revealing cracks that required split-second judgment, coordinated improvisation, and often sheer brute force to correct. The hoplite's shield was both protector and weapon, absorbing blows from enemy spears and arrows, while simultaneously knocking aside opponents to create openings for the dory. Spears jabbed forward in layered depth, each rank supporting the next, creating a hedge of iron that extended far beyond the reach of most adversaries. But even the most disciplined formations could falter. Uneven ground, fatigue, or the sudden collapse of a neighboring unit could shatter the illusion of invulnerability, turning the tightly knit phalanx into a chaotic struggle of individuals. Some historians argue that this fragility, masked by drills and cohesion, was a hidden Achilles heel, later exploited by armies that favored flexibility, like the Romans. Despite these dangers, the phalanx remained the dominant battlefield force for centuries, a testament to the combination of strategy, training, and social cohesion that Greek city-states could muster. Ancient writers recount the clang of bronze meeting bronze, the screams of men, the clouds of dust rising like mist over the blood-soaked earth. And yet, within this chaos, there existed a strange, disciplined rhythm, an almost ritualistic dance of life and death. The hoplites' success was as much about psychology and trust as it was about spears and shields, a delicate balance between collective action and individual courage. And as the sun set on countless battlefields, leaving bodies and broken weapons in its wake, one question lingered: how long could even the most formidable formation endure before the relentless evolution of warfare would expose its vulnerabilities, and the human mind behind the metal would face the ultimate test? As centuries passed, the hoplite did not remain static. Their methods, formations, and strategies evolved in response to the shifting tides of warfare, geography, and politics, revealing a constant dialogue between tradition and innovation. Early hoplite engagements were dominated by rigid phalanxes, but some researchers believe that exposure to irregular forces like infantry, cavalry, and mercenary bands forced Greek commanders to reconsider the limits of linear tactics. The rectangular formations that once sufficed on open plains proved less effective in hilly or broken terrain, where gaps could open unexpectedly, threatening to unravel even the most disciplined lines. To adapt, generals began experimenting with echeloned formations, staggered depths, and combinations of hoplites with supporting archers or slingers, seeking to retain the devastating striking power of the phalanx while gaining flexibility. Others suggest that these tactical shifts were as much social as they were military, reflecting the increasing reliance on mercenary troops whose skills and motivations differed from citizen soldiers, requiring commanders to integrate disparate fighting styles without fracturing cohesion. Visualize the carefully drilled lines, now interspersed with nimble skirmishers, the deep ranks giving way to lighter units poised to exploit weaknesses, all moving across uneven ground where the rhythmic march of the past gave way to a more fluid, adaptive choreography. Spear lengths varied, shields were adjusted, and some hoplites carried secondary weapons or tools for close combat, signaling a willingness to depart from strict classical doctrine. Even within these changes, the essence of hoplite warfare remained, a delicate balance between individual skill and collective discipline, where one soldier's hesitation could cascade into disaster, and one courageous act could inspire a ripple of resilience across the line. Scholars debate the speed and extent of these evolutions, noting that some city-states clung to traditional tactics longer than others, their conservatism both a source of pride and a vulnerability. The introduction of new equipment, such as lighter helmets and more maneuverable shields, hints at the constant tension between protection and mobility, a compromise that shaped the very identity of the hoplite. Each tactical adjustment carried consequences, both expected and unforeseen, influencing not only the outcome of battles, but also the broader social structures that sustained military service. And as historians trace the subtle shifts from rigid phalanx to more adaptive forms of warfare, one question remains suspended in the air. Could the hoplites, masters of their time, truly anticipate the innovations that would one day render their proud formations obsolete? Or were they always marching toward a destiny written by forces beyond their control?